Bill.
Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Nathan Guy.
Mr Chair, I seek leave for the debate on the 47 parts of the Statutes Amendment Bill to be taken as one debate, with the questions on each part to be put separately at the end of the debate.
Members, leave is sought for that purpose. Is there any objection? Being no objection, we will do as the leave has been sought for. So the question now is that clauses 1 and 2 and parts 1 to 47 and schedules 1 to 3 stand part. Mr Chair. I call Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, and it's great to have the opportunity to speak freely across the Statutes Amendment Bill, which was considered by the Government Administration Committee in a collegial manner some time ago now. Well, we thought we should, just to see how it went. And it was certainly an interesting exercise. We didn't have a great deal of, or great number of submissions that came to the committee, although we did have one or two. And I want in this first contribution to make a couple of general remarks around statutes amendment bills and how they come before the House. And I did raise this in my second reading speech, but I think it's worth repeating now as we start to go through clause by clause or part by part within this bill, because statutes amendment bills have been around for many years, and Mr McGee's fantastic book tells us that they were prevalent in the 50s and 60s and again in the early 1990s, but they had been in abeyance for some years. Traditionally, they've contained, and I'm quoting here, non-controversial amendments such as corrections of drafting errors. And a practice is developed that if anyone objects to a clause in the committee stages, then it'll be thrown out. So there's been an assumption that the bills will largely deal with omissions, corrections that need to be made to update laws, where dates get out of synchronisation, where there are omissions that are really of a technical nature. And concerns were raised in the process that several of the parts in this bill are in fact somewhat more than that. We're certainly pushing the boundaries of whether we're talking about omissions or corrections and moving more into the nature of policy, more into the nature of shifts in policy. And they may not be major shifts in policy. They may not be earth-shattering changes that New Zealanders will wake up and read the newspaper tomorrow morning and wonder why on earth Parliament did this. But they are shifts in policy. They are not simply omissions or corrections. And I think it is worth us dwelling on that for a period of time, just to make sure that we are clear and aware for future statutes amendment bills that, given the process for putting them into this House, we cannot really afford for them to be major policy changes or policy changes at all, because they are not undergoing the policy development process, the scrutiny that we would expect of policy changes. And I want to highlight, Mr Chair, two examples which the committee dealt with. The first was one that did attract a public submission, and that was Part 9, which is a change to the Conservation Act 1987. Now, the change in particular here is to extend out the liability in terms of people who are either the owners of or are in charge of dogs which commit an offence, and if that dog attacks or seriously injures or kills protected wildlife in a controlled dog area or an open dog area. Now, what this bill does is it extends it out so it makes it so that it is an either-or situation, either being the owner or the person in charge of the dog. And we received a submission, Mr Chair, in the committee from a lawyer, Graham Edgeler, who's somebody who's known to many people in the House, I think as somebody who looks closely at the legislation that goes through this Parliament. Mr Edgeler is indeed somebody who, as my colleague Mr Chevelle notes, is very focused on Parliament and perhaps might benefit from being in the wild, perhaps with a dog or not. But Mr Edgeler, in his submission to us, stated that he believed the amendment wasn't appropriate for inclusion in a statutes amendment bill because it does not merely involve the correction of an error or oversight in the Conservation Act. It involves extending serious criminal liability up to a year's prison to a class of persons whose actions were not previously subject to criminal sanction. Now, the point that Mr Edgeler goes on to make is it's not that he necessarily doesn't agree with the change, but that this process is not one that that we would normally see occurring in a statutes amendment bill. And from the Labor Party's point of view, we shared similar concerns that it seemed to be extending the scope of the offence rather than correcting an error. Now, as we discussed it in the committee and we decided that it was reasonable and the change was a good one, that we could support it, that doesn't take away from our concern that this is an example, particularly when you're widening offences, creating a greater liability, that is actually a change that deserves close scrutiny. So while we can accept the point that's been made here that this was an inconsistency within the Conservation Act, it was inconsistent with other acts around National Parks Act. Mr Chair, thank you, Mr Chair. It was inconsistent with other acts, the Conservation Act and the National Parks Act, and we could see that the change, in fact, wouldn't create the potential for people to be charged in two ways because the word "or" is included, so it's the owner of the dog or the person in charge of the dog. So we understand the technical detail here, but it is a change and it is an example of the Statutes Amendment Bill here being used to slightly push out the boundaries. And we just want to put a note of caution in, Mr Chair, that that is perhaps not where we should be heading with our Statutes Amendment Bills. We need to keep them being simple and largely technical, because that way they can flow through the House quickly, address the particular technical concerns without being bogged down in a policy process. The other example, Mr Chair, that I just want to mention now in that regard is Part 4 of the Statutes Amendment Bill, which is changes to the Birth, Death, Marriages and Relationships Registration Act. Now, this is an interesting change because this amends Section 9(2) of the Births, Deaths, Marriages and Relationships Registration Act, which is around the reasons why only one parent needs to be registered when somebody is born. And currently the Act allows for that to take place where, among other things, one of the parents is unavailable. And the definition of unavailable was meaning dead, unknown, missing, of unsound mind, or unable to act by virtue of a medical condition. Now, the concern was that that's a very narrow definition of being unavailable, and if a parent's generally unavailable in perhaps what would be the ordinary sense of the word, i.e. that they're not there, that wasn't actually able to be covered by the definition that's currently in the bill. And so the change that's been made will insert into there, it is not reasonably practicable to obtain the other parent's signature because he or she is overseas and he or she cannot be contacted within a period of time that is reasonable in the circumstances. Once again, an eminently sensible idea and one that reflects the reality of people's daily lives, that sometimes people will be unavailable. They'll leave the country, they won't have a forwarding address, and people won't be able to be contacted. But that is a change in policy in many senses. It's a change in saying that we are now accepting that, and that the policy will now be not that you had to be of unsound mind or dead or completely missing, but just that you couldn't be contacted. Now, again, a sensible change perhaps, Mr Chair, but one that is necessary and important to have, I think, a debate about. Now, we did do that in the committee, and that has returned to the House as part of the bill, but it does indicate to us that, again, we've got a couple of examples here where the bill is perhaps extending itself a little beyond what we've traditionally seen as statutes amendment bills. So, Mr Chair, I mean, the Labor Party will be supporting the inclusion of both of those clauses within this bill, but I do think it's important to recognise that this kind of change and these kinds of bills are prescribed for a reason, because they're not always open to the level of scrutiny that they would be if they were going through the normal policy process with all the consultation with the public that we traditionally associate with policy change. And Mr Chair, that's, the Government Administration Committee took its responsibilities seriously in this regard, and we did call for submissions, which some people felt perhaps was unnecessary, but I think what these two examples highlight is why sometimes it does become necessary to do that. I also would note that this bill was in fact a collation of 2 years' worth of statutes amendment bills, and sometimes that I think also makes it difficult because there are just so many clauses, and obviously there were practical reasons for that. But I think having separate bills for each year is good because it limits the range of the different clauses and makes it easier to keep up with. But I guess in closing in this call, Mr Chair, I would note that the process of each party being able to object was retained, and that's useful. And so we worked through our differences, and I think it's important that the Statutes amendment process continues to allow